Happy Friday. It's good to be back with you in the flesh. I'm Jessica Burbank, and I'm here with Amber Athey. How's it going, Amber?
Great. We're back in black, as they say.
We're back in black. It's very Amy Winehouse. I was listening to Amy Winehouse on the way here, so that's perfect.
I was thinking AC/DC. You can tell the generational divide.
Oh, yeah. Back to black is Amy. Yeah, that's fine. But we're filling in for Robbie and Bree. They're slacking off, I guess, having an extra long weekend this Friday. So let's get into it. Amber, what's going on today?
Sure. A federal judge has sentenced Stewart Rhodes, founder of the right-wing extremist group the Oath Keepers, to serve 18 years in prison following his conviction on seditious conspiracy charges for his role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. This is the longest prison term assigned to a figure involved in that day. Here's what Rhodes' attorneys have to say about his sentencing.
I think that's a huge question. Look, in terms of leader of January 6th, there were 10,000 plus people on the Hill that day. And it was uncontroverted evidence that Mr. Rhodes, with the co-conspirator indicted now, Kelly Sorrell, they weren't even on the Hill when this entire situation started. I don't think it's up to me to point the finger and place blame on ultimately any given individual. I know that there's a large swath of society that intends to and will be pointing blame to the very top of what was the American society at the time. And I'll leave it to them to do that. We don't have a dog in that fight. Our dog in the fight was Mr. Rhodes. This is a year and a half now, cap-ended into this with an 18-year sentence, and there will be appellate issues.
So sounds like they're going to appeal. I, for one, was pretty surprised at just how heavy the sentence was, especially considering Rhodes never actually entered the Capitol that day. I guess they're claiming that he had pre-planned some kind of event with the Oath Keepers, but just based on what I'm reading, the evidence seems a little thin.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weak defense if it's true that he was partaking in the planning, right? If someone writes the blueprints to construct a building but isn't the one building it, did he have a role in making the building? Yeah, I would say a pretty big one. He's the one who made the plans for it. So I don't know if that's a strong defense, if he was someone who planned and inspired and organized people to go to the Capitol that day. What really struck me about this clip is actually the white suit. It's really giving like mob attorney vibes.
That's not what you want from your attorney that's defending you from seditious conspiracy.
He shows up in a white suit. It's like, yeah, I'm guilty.
At first glance, I thought it was Kevin Spacey. That was his lawyer, and I was like, that's also not good. So
that would be fun. I think we should just, commit to the demise of American politics and make it as entertaining as possible for everyone involved.
Well, might as well. I mean, that's what Trump 2024 is going to be. It'll just be probably a comedy show in probably the best way possible. But I was looking at some of the statements that the prosecutors were talking about that he apparently made in connection with supposedly planning January 6th. Mm-hmm. And I think what's weird to me is that they repeatedly say that he was questioning the results of the election and kind of mouthing off about how there was going to be a civil war, which was kind of a running theme along the January 6th protesters, at least the ones who were the first to kind of rush the Capitol. But it doesn't sound like outside of that there was much of an intent to actually foment a riot on that day. I didn't see any statements from him, for example, where they were saying that let's organize the Oath Keepers to rush the Capitol building and we'll stop the certification of the election results. So I kind of feel like they're making an example out of this guy. I know they also denied him bail because he has an underground tunnel system under his house, but the tunnels don't go anywhere. And as a kind of a nutty prepper adjacent person myself.
Oh, we're learning about Amber.
I know. I'm exposing myself. But I was like, tunnels under your house, I don't hate it,
You were like, he's fine.
Yeah, I was like, that's normal.
Too. Everybody, you guys don't have tunnels? What are you talking about? But I think what makes this case especially interesting, the timing of it. I mean, where were the convictions right after January 6th?
Yeah, it's been
Not only that, last week we covered them saying there were hundreds of federal agents at the Capitol, and we can't show the footage. it seems that this case, they're going to need to show some footage and say, he wasn't there at the Capitol. This is him leaving. If he was there earlier at the rally, I mean, maybe we'll get some stuff admitted into evidence because of this case that otherwise we wouldn't see. But of course, they have this defense that they always have, where it's like, oh, well, it's not safe for the public if we release this information. It's sensitive information. But this coming out right after they make this statement, there were hundreds of federal agents there, and that's why we can't release the footage, seems fishy to me.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really great point, especially considering after Tucker Carlson played a lot of that footage on his Fox News show, they ended up letting Jacob Chansley, the QAnon shaman, out of prison early. He was supposed to serve, I think, several years, if not 4 or 5 years, and then they released him because the clips showed that he was not involved in any of the actual violent actions. He was basically just trespassing. And not to mention the fact that Ray Epps, this random guy who lives in the Midwest, who was shouting on camera that people should storm the Capitol building and actually did storm the Capitol building, or at least admitted to being in there, has not been charged with anything. So the FBI claims that he's not one of theirs, yet Stewart Rhodes gets 18 years. Ray Epps, who was encouraging people the day before, gets nothing. It's all so bizarre.
Yeah, the inconsistency in prosecuting everyone involved in January 6th. And then we have elected officials like Marjorie Taylor Greene after it happened was like, well, if I did it, it would have been armed, which was the most unhinged response you could have to an attempted insurrection on the Capitol. And so you have folks in high positions of power, Trump encouraging the whole thing, Merrick Garland saying, maybe I won't do actually anything at all about this, nothing in the short term. And then in the long term, when he announces his bid for president, I'll say, well, now we can't do anything because it would seem political. It's just so weak how they've approached the whole January 6th thing. And it's just created a recipe where I think if people wanted to do it again, they would be more likely to do it again because they saw what a mess it was and how few people actually ended up getting prosecuted.
For me, I have the opposite tack on this, which is that it's kind of stunning to me how aggressive the sentencing has been for these people, considering that we have had riots all throughout the summer of 2020 where people similarly stormed state houses. We had individuals creating an autonomous zone in Seattle and Portland and keeping police and emergency vehicles out of it, basically hijacking parts of city streets. And there's been seemingly no similar level of prosecution of those individuals. Not to mention this guy just last week who was ramming the White House with his car, claiming that he wanted to, quote, get to the White House, seize power, and be put in charge of the nation, had his charges downgraded. Now he only has a single count of depredation of property. I mean, there's just a disconnect, I think, in terms of how this DOJ is going after people who are doing essentially the same thing, but happen to be on different sides of the political aisle.
Yeah, I have a hard time assigning the same moral weight to, the riots or even the protests and the uprising in 2020. We just had the 3rd anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And so a lot of people are reflecting on what went down in the country and the millions of people that were in the streets there. And I think about the quote, a riot is the voice of the unheard. Was January 6th a riot? I think it was an attempted insurrection, an attempt to take over the United States government, to prevent, the due process, the transfer of power to Joe Biden as president, and the counting of the electoral votes, right? That was their intent. Why do they feel unheard? They feel unheard because they're in a political minority in the country, because they lost. I feel like that's something different than if you're Black and you grew up in America and you've watched people who are unarmed Black men get murdered by the police, and you've watched your family struggle to get by. You've endured racism your entire life in this country, and finally, after so many unarmed Black men had been shot and so many people came to their defense, it's a moment where things need to change. We're not being heard. We've tried to do things the peaceful way and protest peacefully. It's time to get in the streets and burn some stuff. I feel like that's different.
This is exactly the double standard I'm talking about, though, right? Because you agree with their cause, you're saying that it's acceptable for them to commit violence, but it's not acceptable for people to storm the Capitol because they believe that the election was rigged due to the changing of rules at the last minute in terms of who was allowed to vote. And all the unarmed Black men dying, it's less than 12 a year. I mean, the idea that this is some mass epidemic is just not reflective of reality.
I think to say that it's just because I agree with it, maybe, that's not the case. I think it's that the issues are different. What they're protesting is different. One group of folks, the guy they wanted to win lost the election. The other group of folks have endured centuries of violence in the United States and have endured chattel slavery and now endured an era of Jim Crow and police violence. So I think the issues are just different. It's just not comparable, the reason for the rioting, to me. But we've got to move on to the next story. We're going to have more rising after this.